Hey guys, welcome to the Kane Audio vlog. It's Friday, it's time for another Ask Me Anything. Usual rules apply. Comment any question you want below this video and I'll get to you in next week's video and answer the question. Before I look at last week's house admin, it's been a manic week this week and unfortunately I'm just over having a cold at the moment as well, so apologies if I'm a bit sniffly and bunged up. Yeah, it has been insane. I've had loads of jobs in this week and me being me, can't say no, so I can't think of anything that needs saying. There was supposed to be a Sonic Academy series of mixdown videos. I know you've all been asking for mixdown tutorials. I spent ages putting one together for Sonic Academy. Unfortunately we've hit a bit of a snag in that, so it's going to be a bit delayed. Nothing major, just paperwork stuff to get out of the way. So I will be telling you more about that soon, but I will say right now, if you're not a member of Sonic Academy, sign up, because it is an awesome space. I know a lot of guys on this channel and the Facebook group and stuff, you know, they're all after tips and tricks and sort of getting started and you know, lots of resources for learning stuff. Sonic Academy is absolutely that. So yeah, so I've done a 10-part mixdown series for them, and that, I don't know when it'll be out now. Obviously it's up to them on their schedule. It's not my job, but yeah, I will say I'm quite proud of this because it's a track I wrote myself that you will all know, and I hated the mix. The original version before the mixdown, there was a lot of issues with the bass line. It wasn't cutting it for me. So yeah, so I go through a mixdown from start to finish and sort of iron out all those little details. So yeah, so it's quite a good, well, hopefully quite a good video series. Yeah, so I'll announce that more when I've got the date. What else is there? I think that's about it in terms of what I need to say to you guys. Yeah, can't think of anything else. So, on with last week's questions. Deadly Custard 42, high five. Thanks, Dom. Never really thought about the transposing stuff around, so we'll try that. Nerdy question for you. So the transposing stuff was, I think I was talking about remixes and how to sort of approach a remix in stripping the parts back, and then maybe transposing into a different key and additional melodies and whatever. If you want more information, go to last week's AMA. When making the low end of your bass mono, do you prefer squashing the stereo signal into a mono state or removing the sides so you are left with the center? Okay, and which of these do mono makers like Brainworks do? That's a good question. I've never even thought about it. I should imagine it squishes the sides into mono, because that's how if you press a mono button, you don't lose the sides necessarily unless they're phase inverted. Then you don't tend to lose the sides, they just go to the middle. But again, if they're phase inverted, then you may lose elements of it. So I should imagine that's how they do it. But yeah, I never really thought about how you would tackle that, if I'm honest. Yeah. Also, got any track days lined up this year? Track days? Oh, as in car track days? I haven't at the moment. Yeah, we're just getting, in fact, this weekend is probably the first weekend this year that our weather is looking like we might be coming out of winter. Might have spoke too soon there, but yeah, over the winter a lot of the tracks kind of shut down. I mean, you know, they still do the odd thing here and there, but it's not so good for proper track days. And now I've moved to Manchester, of course. It's going to be a different track local to me, and there's actually a couple to choose from, so I'm going to check them out this year and see which one tickles my fancy. Yeah, I'm still thinking about that Brainworks one though. Okay, cool. Yeah, no, I think I've covered that. I don't know is the honest answer. Nightquaker, Don Brother. So I was watching Joel's interview thing about his Neve 5088 console yesterday, and he said in fully plug-in relying studios, people can get pissy when plugins get updated and are incompatible anymore, when OS updates break things, etc. I've not seen the interview, but it sounds familiar, as I've spent a lot of time on this channel talking about Apple forcing OS updates. And interestingly on that, before I get into a bit of a side note, for any of you guys that remember me banging on about Apple forcing updates and then refusing updates, and then everything becomes just unsupported on a machine, and how frustrating it can be. And if you remember, when I was making these videos at the time, I was using Final Cut Pro, and that was taking forever all of a sudden, just randomly one day, for no reason whatsoever. Every time I wanted to render something down, something that normally took maybe 10 minutes suddenly took 8, 9, 10 hours. You know, it wasn't an insignificant jump, it was humongous. Well, interestingly, the other day my whole computer started slowing down, and I looked at the main hard drive. I've got 5 hard drives in there, but I looked at the main post-boot drive where documents and everything are, and it's a 4 terabyte hard drive, and I had something like 50 gig left, and I was like, right, okay, well that's obviously why it's slowing down. So a quick tip to any of you guys, especially you guys working on laptops, keep your hard drive, you kind of want it 50% empty if you can. Anything less than 10% available, and macOS just slows right down and really starts going down the shitter. So yeah, so I sort of looked at it and thought, well, that's weird, because I know I have a lot of big files and I've been doing these vlog videos and whatever, but I kind of delete them once I'm like 3 episodes, you know, beyond a project file. I just delete it, because I figure, well, it's on YouTube, these AMAs are not exactly cinematic, are they? So so yeah, so I thought, well, that's weird, because I can't think why there'd be so much stuff. So anyway, I traced it all back. Lo and behold, Final Cut Pro, it seems like if you delete the raw video files and the project files, it doesn't actually delete everything related to that project. So yeah, so I ended up shifting a load of stuff and deleting some libraries and whatever, and I deleted an empty library, which was my vlog library, which had 0 videos and 0 projects in there. Deleted it, and it was 2.5 terabytes of nothing. So yeah, for anyone that uses that, keep an eye open. Anyway, I digress. Yeah, so we're talking about software updates. Obviously people are right to get pissy about that. So Joel mentioned that hardware doesn't have that problem. Well, I'm not sure if I agree with that totally. I agree with the sentiment of what he's saying, but I guess also hardware comes with firmware updates, which can sometimes be more fiddly. But I think the difference is that they're not, that nobody forces you into those updates, and I guess that's the key to it, is that because a piece of hardware doesn't usually know when its firmware is out of date or not operating correctly, which, although sounds like a worse thing, it's probably a bit of a godsend in a lot of ways, because if you're running a big desk or a synth or whatever, and you know, it needs a firmware update, you don't really know, because it's not telling you about that, because it's most of these devices are not directly connected to the internet telling you, ping, you need to update. And they, yeah, generally they don't lose compatibility. Certainly the signal path is never going to lose compatibility, because it's just a straight line of electrons. So Joel mentioned hardware doesn't have that problem. So my question is, since a lot of hardware things, be it synths or outboard effects processing gear, don't need drivers or anything like that, do you consider it being an advantage of using hardware instead of software? Basically, a lot of the hardware never becomes incompatible or obsolete because it doesn't have any software, firmware or drivers tied to it. Obviously hardware can break or wear out, but that's a whole other story. Yeah, I've got to be honest, I don't think I've really thought about that too much. But now it's been pointed out, it's a pretty obvious one, I suppose, but I've just never given it much thought. Yeah, I guess with hardware, they don't really lose incompatibility, much like I just said, because, you know, especially if it's an analog signal path, you know, you've got your DI input and your DI output, and that's that. It makes a sound, and it does what you want it to do. Perhaps more significantly in the way that I use hardware as well, because I don't tend to save presets, and I don't tend to use any of the menu systems too much. I tend to dive right into just twiddling the knobs, and then when I'm happy with the sound, I'll hit record and have that, and then move on and create another sound or whatever. So I don't tend to sit on it too much, and I don't tend to recall them either. And I find that quite freeing, because, you know, even though, as I've said plenty of times before, you know, if you look at all my Mau5trap releases, for example, they've all got common sounds, but none of those two sounds are actually identical, because every time I use that sound I recreate it from scratch, because I enjoy the process of that, and I enjoy the nuances that happen with them, and I enjoy the accidents that come out from getting it wrong. So yeah, I would say that is an advantage for hardware over software. I don't think it needs to be one though, and that's where I need to be careful, I suppose, because if you've written a piece of software, let's say a VST, and it works fine, you know, I think we've all got a lot of VSTs that are maybe written by smaller companies or one-man bands or whatever, and, you know, they'll have version 1.1 or whatever, and then maybe 5 years later offer an update of 1.2 or something. You know, if it works, it works. I guess you're less likely to have compatibility issues with hardware when it's really just sending out an audio signal, so it doesn't need as you say, it doesn't need the drivers and you know, compatible firmwares or anything like that. So yeah, I guess that's a big advantage now I think about it, but it's not one I've thought much about, because I always feel like software versus hardware is almost a non-argument, because they've both got their places, and they've both got completely different available functions and pros and cons. So I kind of think it's, you know, it's comparing apples with oranges, and I prefer oranges. Yeah, obviously hardware can break out, blah 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 blah. Do you have a similar stance on hardware? Right, I think I've covered that. Thank you. Deadmouse5 42, high five. Obold Thorn 42, high five. Yanis Lukmanis 42, high five. Rod Marconi, hi Dom, when using reference tracks during the mix stage, is it necessary to have them in the same key for a better reference? Hope this makes sense. 42, high five. I suppose it's... do you know what? I don't use reference tracks all that often. And in fact, sometimes I think it's best not to, because if you're referencing for production purposes, you're probably referencing a mixed and mastered version, so of course that other track is going to sound better, and it's just going to be depressing as shit to compare it. If you're using it for mix purposes, I think you need to be careful, because the one you're referencing is probably mastered as well, but also you kind of need to be careful because every mixdown is different. Every track has a different set of percussion, or a different kick drum, or a different bass line, or whatever it is. You know, the instrumentation is not going to be identical, and I think you need to be careful with directly referencing, as I'm assuming we're talking about A-Bing between two tracks, which, by the way, if you do want to do in terms of mixdown and master, New Gen Audio Master Check allows you to reference external tracks, and it will measure the dynamics of an external track, which can be very handy, without you necessarily having to even listen to the other track, so it's just running in the background. Yeah, so A-Bing directly when you're referencing mixdowns or masters or whatever. Masters not so bad, because you're just referencing loudness, and I guess that's, you know, a fully measurable thing. Whereas if you're referencing a mixdown or a production or something like that, then A-Bing is not always a good idea, because you're comparing apples and oranges. One of them's been polished and one of them hasn't, so there's always going to be a big difference there anyway. The other thing is that if you know, if the rhythms of the bass line and the notation of the bass line and the sound design of the kick drums, for example, are not perfectly balanced in both of those tracks, i.e. identical in both tracks, then it becomes very difficult to weigh how heavy one is compared to the other, if that makes sense. I feel like I'm just waffling there, but yeah, so it's kind of a tricky one. The best way to reference, I think, is really to sort of play your track, have a listen to it, and not think too much. Just listen to frequencies and whatever. Don't think about the notes or anything like that, and then maybe give yourself a 2-minute break and then listen to your reference track, and maybe have a few minutes of that and then a few minutes break, and then go back again and sort of take it that slow and steady way, just to kind of remember, oh yeah, I'm looking for a big width, or oh, I'm looking for a big crescendo, or whatever. So when it comes to that, then if it's in the same key, then that's useful. I would say it's definitely a preference to be in the same key, but I don't think it's essential. But I do think you know, and again, you know, I have to think about the fact that most of the viewers of this channel are probably not sat in a multi-million-pound studio, so you probably have standing waves in certain frequencies in your room, or your headphones react differently to different frequencies. So again, you know, if you're dealing with two tracks in two different keys, one of them might be in a slightly rough area, whereas the other one might not be, and in which case, you know, it becomes difficult to compare those two things. So yeah, hopefully some of that makes sense. I can feel my head closing in as I speak. So yeah, I think that answers that. Who's next? Where are we? Kevin Sramek. Hey Dom, thank you for the detailed answer on your fave and least fave track. It would be interesting to hear saved, but if you can't find it, no worries. It's difficult to find a song you've made years ago. But anyways, have a great weekend. Thank you. You're welcome. 42 high five. Yeah, I said saved last week. I don't think it was saved. I'm sure it was, because I thought about it afterwards and I didn't look for it, but I thought about it and I think it might be called spaced, something like that. I'll find it at some point. But yeah, I think it's particularly tricky because it was one that I released on my label, I think, and I took down pretty much everything from my label a few years ago, bar a couple of sites that never got round to doing it, which is annoying, but whatever. So yeah, so I will try and dig that out. Cavouquet, another interesting AMA Dom. It's always a highlight when I remember it's Friday, so a new AMA should be waiting. You even managed to touch on the answer to the meaning of life, the universe and everything this week. 42. High five. In fact, a double high five for the Hitchhiker's reference. This whole hardware versus software debate is quite interesting. I can definitely see the benefits, immediacy, spontaneity, etc. of hardware. However, for my own work, it almost makes me want to go further into the software realm. Having spent most of my life working in IT, I feel more comfortable in front of a screen tapping keys than twisting knobs and plugging in patch cables. So I guess the best approach depends on your personal preferences. Yes, 100%. And I guess this is maybe something I've not mentioned enough, but a lot of people sort of compare the software hardware debate and whatever, and you know what, it really comes down to personal preference and background. So, you know, as Cavouquet says there, you know, he comes from an IT background, so actually software makes more sense to him. That's the way his mind maps things out. You know, I come from, I guess, a bit of both, and maybe that's why I'm always on the fence, because I was kind of a computer nerd as a kid in the 80s, 90s, but at the same time, you know, I have an engineering degree and come from an engineering background as well, so I was always, you know, even as a young teenager, I was always trying to sort of buy shitty broken old amps and fix them up and replace fuses and only basic stuff, and replace some valves or tubes or whatever in there, and you know, it was fairly basic work, but for me, I thought I was being an electrical genius by replacing a bulb. But you know, that's the background I come from, so I like both, but for two very different reasons. And like I say, I think they both have their place in this world, really. What's she doing?
Sorry, I don't know that one.
She doesn't have a preference over software or hardware, apparently. No, there we go. I don't know if you could even see that, could you? That was my Amazon Echo. Where was I? There we go. Yeah, so it depends on personal preferences. However, maybe there's also something to be said for taking yourself out of your comfort zone, and I'm interested in learning more about hardware, as both approaches have strengths. Yeah, absolutely. And as I've said, again, I think I've even said in this video that, you know, I sometimes like the restrictions of hardware. I find that quite liberating. One thing I will say on that note as well is somebody messaged me or commented on Instagram, I think it was, recently this week. I can't remember who it was now, but they had mentioned that they'd bought a Moog Sub 37 and then got rid of it because they just found they didn't like the menu system and that side of it, and they just didn't get on with it. And this is something that, you know, I think a lot of people need to be careful of, is that, you know, when you're dealing with hardware versus software, they're just entirely different experiences. With software, you know, clearly you can make a really cool user interface, and, you know, you can make things that just work and that are much more flowing and creative. Whereas with hardware, you know, something like the Moog Sub 37, you know, to me, to someone who's used a lot of hardware synths, the menu system in that is just brilliant. It's fluid, it's so intuitive. But actually, I think if you've never used a hardware synth in your life and you look at that menu system, you'd probably just wince and just go, this is horrible, what's going on? And I don't think it can really be improved upon unless you had essentially an iPad stuck to your screen and that was your user interface with a touch screen. So again, yeah, so it definitely comes down to where your background is and where your strengths are. A couple of questions this week. First, as my mate has just bought a Sub 37, Talk of the Devil, I'm hoping to play with that soon. How easy will it be to know which are your presets? I've no idea, to be honest. I don't think I could even pick them out myself half the time, whether that be on the Slim Fatty, Little Fatty, whatever the whole sort of series that I did presets for. Yeah, I don't know. I think, was it the Sub 37? No. No, I think you'd probably be hard pressed to work out which ones. There might be one or two sounds where you go, oh, it sounds familiar, but that's about it. I tend not to necessarily, especially when we're dealing with a generic factory preset bank, I tend not to specifically go for my style of sound or whatever. It's more about what a synth is capable of. In fact, somebody tweeted me this morning. I noticed, I haven't even opened Twitter yet, but I saw the notification come through. Someone had bought a synth and they were saying that they spotted my presets on this synth straight away. And I read the name of the synth, and I'm not going to say it because I don't think this is helpful to their cause. But I read the name of the synth and thought, I vaguely remember working on that, and it took me a while to think about the fact that I'd worked on this synth probably 5-6 years ago, forgotten all about it, obviously never used the synth since, and I'm not suggesting that's a good or bad thing at all, because there could be a multitude of reasons for having not used it. But yeah, like I say, I couldn't even remember what synth I had worked on, and I'd forgotten all about that one. So yeah, so in terms of picking out presets, like I say, I don't think I could pick out what I've done and what I haven't done. So that probably doesn't help, but it's the answer. Also, you've mentioned that you're thinking about putting together a new live setup. I can see my camera's on 27 minutes and it cuts out at 30 and restarts, so I'm just going to restart it now before I start this next bit of the question, and I'm going to just cough my guts up and have a sneeze. See you in a sec. Okay, that's better. Yeah, having a cold and being an audio engineer is not a good combination. Because the first thing that goes for me is my ears, and they start popping. Right, where was I? Oh yeah. So still on Cavalcade. You've mentioned that you're thinking there's only a bit left I can see here. In fact, I think this is the last question, so we're getting there. You've mentioned that you're thinking about putting together a new live setup. Have you made any progress on that? Are you planning to incorporate Bitwig, and if so, how will you trigger clips or loop what you've played? Yes, so I've not really made much progress recently. What I did do was I set up a Bitwig project, and it's kind of tricky because what I want to do is basically keep it down to say 8 channels if I can. So for example, if you've got drums, then rather than having an individual channel for each drum or percussive element or whatever, I think we have to separate kicks from the rest of the drums. Then what I do is I sort of create loops from then on. So you've got kicks and then drums, and in drums would be your hi-hats, your claps, your percussion, whatever, and you might have, say, 2 or 3 different variations of that. So you might have just the percussion, or percussion and claps, or claps and hats, or whatever. So you have some sort of variation. So if you need some percussion in the breakdown, then it's available as a loop. And then for things like bass lines, the vast majority of my bass lines or bass leads come from the Moog, which is something I would definitely want to be using live. So I'd have an empty audio channel to receive the input of that, but then I'd also have a MIDI channel to trigger, because for example if it's just a rolling 8th note or 16th note bass line on one note, I'm not going to stand there and just press it every time. And also there's no point in me recording that as a loop. I mean I could, but I don't see the point when I could just have a pre-made loop, or a not a pre-made loop but a pre-made MIDI clip with those notes written in, where I can just hit play and that will loop around, and then I can play with the effects and the filters and whatever on the synth as well. And then obviously you go into leads, chords, whatever, effects. So I'd kind of got as far as building a basic version of that. I think I'd thrown in parts for, and I kind of printed some stems that were maybe 32 bars long, and then some were maybe 4 bars long, and then some would be looped and some wouldn't, and I kind of programmed that for like 2 or 3 tracks into a project file, and then I started, because I felt like I needed that as a project file before I could even consider what hardware or what, you know, would I be going with like a NI machine, or would it be, you know, a Behringer trigger something, or, you know, there's no point in looking at what kind of launch pads or whatever you're going to use until you know what you need. So I figured I'd start with a project file first and just do it manually with software, and I got about as far as that, and then started looking at it, and then felt like I needed more tracks in there and more playing around before I could really judge on hardware. But my aim in my head was 8 channels, because I felt like that was an easy number to achieve, but it wasn't that easy, so maybe 16 would be more appropriate. But then you're talking about big mixing desks, and then it gets more expensive and more complicated. And yeah, and I had a very quick look at some hardware, and none of it really suited what I wanted in my head, because I needed, you know, at least 8 gain sliders for the channels, and then I'd want send and returns for each. And I do have hidden up there, I think, a MIDI controller. What was it called? Evolution something, that I used when I started laptop DJing 15 years ago, or whenever that was. And that would probably suffice, but it'd be nice to have something that wasn't caked in mud and sand and whatever from touring. And they don't make them anymore, they have stopped making them a long time ago. But yeah, so I never really found the bit of hardware, but it's something I'm still planning on doing. So absolutely I'm planning on incorporating Bitwig. As for how I'll trigger clips or loops or what I've played, I've no idea, and I think that was the bit that kind of stopped me progressing with it for the time being. You know, I've looked at various MIDI controllers, and some of them are just way overpriced for what they are, and then the vast majority of the ones where I thought, oh, that looks really good, it was just maybe one slider too short, or I just felt like it needed an extra row of dials above, or the dials were, you know, had a start and stop position, and they weren't infinite rotary dials, which is what I'd prefer. So yeah, so I never quite got there. I felt like probably the way forward is a custom mixer. And I can't imagine that's cheap either, and I'm not in a position in life to maybe do that just yet. So I think for the time being I'll probably use something like the first machine, along with maybe something like the Evolution or something like that, and just, it's a case of experimenting really until I get there. Yeah, I don't think there is a right way or a wrong way of doing these things. But at the same time, I also feel like I need a good 2 or 3 hours worth of original music to get it done, and I would want that music to be good music, obviously, and that, you know, let's be honest, that's the most important part of any live show, is the actual music. And yeah, and I don't think I'm quite there yet. So in my head I sort of felt like, well, maybe by the time I do my first album, that's probably the time to really start seriously focusing on it. Oh, and another thing I considered was a session musician. That's something I should say. So rather than having, or as well as having MIDI controllers, I have spoken to a session musician who's a multi-instrumentalist who could essentially play keys and also sing and also play drums, and he is amazing at electronica kind of stuff. So that was another thing I sort of considered, was why have just me, because that kind of seems a bit silly when, you know, if you look at perhaps the bigger stage shows, I mean, obviously you've got people like deadmau5 and Eric Prydz and whatever, and they're doing their thing and that's great, and Stefan Bodzin, they're doing their thing and that's great, and then you've got the bigger, in terms of humans involved, you've got things like Chemical Brothers, Orbital, Daft Punk, you know, people like that, and having that extra person really adds a dynamic to what you're able to achieve musically, I think. So in my head I kind of figured, well, why not just have a session musician, you know, because actually if you go see, I'll say, Sam Smith live in concert, it's not just him on his own, you know, with an acoustic guitar or whatever, you know, he has a whole band with him. So I kind of figured that maybe that's something that needs to happen in electronic music, is we need to be a bit more relaxed in how we approach it and actually get a band on board, and you know, get another person for the drum machine, another person for keyboards, whatever, and like I say, so long as the music's good, then it's all good. P.S. Your track saved is still available on Beatport. Oh, there we go. So Beatport were one of the ones that never took it down, I guess, because I'm pretty sure I sent out a notification. Oh, what's this? Welcome to Beatport. What kind of equipment do you use? The hell's that? I'm not into DJing. I'm going to click. Right, so if I search my own name and then, yeah, look at that, they've got some really old crap on there. Tracks. Alright, let's find out, because it's bugging me. I think I might have called it Space or Spaced or something rather than Jesus, how many tracks have I released? Do you know what, a lot of this is people re-releasing stuff. Obviously after I got signed to Mau5trap, a lot of people tried cashing in on that. Saved, I can see. Let's have a look at that. That's not the one I was thinking of. That's quite cool then. What's that? Exposed. Oh, that's terrible. Space Cadet, was it that? Yeah, this one, Space Cadet. Yeah, forgot all about that. Very 2008. Yeah, so that's probably one of my favourite productions, Space Cadet. I mean, obviously listening back now is a bit cringy because the actual production values are not very good. But I still like that track. I like what I did because I remember grabbing random samples and just throwing bits around and then playing with effects, and that was, I think, one of the first production, maybe not one of the first, but it was a production where I genuinely just enjoyed the whole process of making it, and that, so it still kind of, you know, I still get that satisfaction from it now. So yeah, as for worst production, there's probably so many here. Tonal display, that was a good one as well, I think. In fact, that was one Deadmau5 liked as well. Yeah, that was a cool track. Anyway, that's enough reminiscing about how old I am. So there we go, and as Cakewalk says, wow, that was quite the aimless ramble, sorry. I'll say the same about myself. So that is it for today, guys. Thank you very much for watching. If you've been watching this far in and you're still listening, especially after old man listens to his own music, then thank you very much, and show your support by commenting the word I'm going to say the word fake. So yeah, just shout fake everywhere, and watch all the conspiracy theorists jump in and wonder what the hell's going on. Right, so I will see you this time next week. Have a good weekend, guys. Cheers.